discussed about my childhood and the roughness of how things were, and I had to leave. I had to get out of the house. I wasn't sure what I was going to do because I barely graduated high school. So I decided to enlist in the United States military. United States Marine Corps is actually what I enlisted in. I was hesitant to leave home because I knew once I left, there would be nobody left in the house except my mother. So it was a little bit rough for me to leave, but once I did, I was okay. I entered into the United States Marine Corps' security forces, which is embassy duty and sea duty. And after basic training and schools, I ended up, my first duty station was aboard the USS Saratoga here in Jacksonville, Florida, Mayport. On the USS Saratoga, that was my first experience with the hardships and the difficulties with being in the military. The Marines aboard on sea duty are basically the ambulance first responders. So every accident, void explosions, or things that happen with the Marines are the first ones to respond. I was actually the captain's orderly, and the captain's orderly sounds like somebody who gives meals and things like that, but I was basically the bodyguard. So if there's general quarters or something was happening, I had to run up the 14 decks of stairs with all my body armor and my rifle gear and stand behind the captain. Wherever he went, I went with him. That was my duty. During Desert Shield, Desert Storm, that's when I was on the Saratoga, we were called out to the Red Sea. We went across the entire Red Sea through the canal in less than 3 days, and we were floating around the Red Sea. And we sat at sea. We were actually supposed to go on a 14-country med cruise. Instead of going on a 14-country med cruise, we ended up going to the Red Sea, and we floated around for about 9.5 months. Our first stop actually was in Haifa, Israel. I don't know if anybody lived in this area back in 1990. But in December of 1990, their first stop in Haifa, Israel, the weather got really bad, so they tried to get everybody back to the ship as quickly as possible. Because of this, the ferry boats were too heavily loaded, and one of the ferry boats returning to the ship broke in half. And when it broke in half and sank, we lost 21 sailors that drowned, lost their lives. And as the captain's orderly, of course, he was in the back of the ship, because on the back of the aircraft carrier, there was a wooden barge, and that's where the ferry boats would pull up and people would get off. And unfortunately, for the next 2 days, that's where we stood in the back of the ship as they pulled the bodies of our sailors out of the water. That was my first exposure to the hardships within the military. Of course, that was during Desert Shield. When I was on the ship, they asked for volunteers because I actually got promoted to corporal, which was pretty E4. And they asked for volunteers because they needed NCOs in the desert. So, me being young and dumb, 19 years old, it's like, I'm not doing my job on a ship. So, yeah, I'll go. Didn't hear anything else for about 3.5 months until the day we pulled back into port here in Mayport. That day, I got orders to 29 Palms, California, Weapons Company 17, who actually was deployed back in the desert. So I spent 2 weeks getting trained up, and I redeployed. I was actually an anti-tank gunner, a Dragon missile system. It's a wire-guided missile. And so instead of walking around from one extreme to the next, I went from the Red Sea to walking around the desert. In the first Gulf War, basically all we ever did, we walked for 15 to 30 miles a day, every day. And I was a Dragon gunner, so I had actually 2 Dragon guns strapped to my pack. Each Dragon was about 26 pounds. So I had about over 100 pounds of gear walking through the desert every day. And the first live round I ever saw fired or seen fired was in combat. We actually had to go up on top of a bunker, on a hilltop, and blow up 3 bunkers. And that was the first live round I saw shot, and actually the last one. We actually blew up 3 bunkers, and that was that. We got back to the States. When I first arrived here in Florida, I got married. A lot of people get married too young, and I definitely did that. I ended up getting married before we deployed. And then when I was deployed, my son was born. So when I came back after 9.5 months over in Iraq, I found my then wife in a mental institution, and my son was in custody of the state because she actually tried to kill him. Her mother had walked in on him. So I didn't know anything about it when I came back. So when I came back, I found out all this information. I also found out I was $57,000 in debt. And so the Marine Corps does not like that kind of image. They don't like that kind of things because they know draw on my duties. They liked me, so they didn't kick me out. They said, okay, just do your time, finish your time in the service, and separate. Otherwise, we're going to have to bar you from enlistment. And I didn't want that. So I got out and came back home and tried to take care of as much as possible so I can get my son back, because I lost custody because it's called failure to protect. I wasn't there to stop her from harming him, so I lost custody. I actually went to court for over a decade just to get visitation rights. Her father owned a telecommunications business here locally, was pretty well-to-do, and her stepmother wasn't able to have children. So they took my son James in, and it just so happened that the HRS workers on the case, 3 of them were actually fired for taking bribes and everything. We can't prove that it was her parents, but it just so happened that they told me that I had to go to finance school, I had to go to single parenting classes, I had to do all those things. So when I got out of the service, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, so I became a roofer here in Florida briefly, but my wife was cheating with half the neighborhood. So I decided, you know what, this isn't for me, I got to go, I can't fix this, so I decided I wanted to go in the United States Army. I went to the Army recruiter, and I said, you know what, I want to go to the Marine Corps Special Forces. I was mad at the world, I hated everybody. I wanted to go kick down doors and blow things up, that's what I wanted to do. I said, send me to Special Forces, this is what I want to do. They said, you know what, we have 3 things for prior service. I said, what's that? And they said, 73 Delta, 73 Delta, and 73 Delta. I was like, what is that? And they said, accounting. I was like, what? Accounting? And they said, well, I said, you're telling me a Marine Corps infantryman with combat experience, you want to make me an accountant? And they said, well, if you want to come in the service, that's what you have to do. So that's what I did. I hated it at first because it was very difficult, because when I reported my first duty station, my Sergeant First Class, who was in charge of my unit, welcomed himself. He said, hey, I'm Angel. I was like, excuse me? He goes, yeah, Angel Santalese. And I was like, okay, because in the Marine Corps is all rank structured and things, but in the Army, it was much different element. And he introduced himself as Angel, so it was a little bit interesting trying to get into that. I didn't want to be an accountant, but I did do it, and once I became into it, I was actually pretty good at it, and it gave me the opportunity to go to school. It gave me the opportunity to get my bachelor's degree. I got a bachelor's degree in business communications. I graduated with a 3.98 GPA, magna cum laude, but it just so happened that my then commander, my first commander, was a female commander, and my ex-wife found out where I was going before I did. I'm not sure how this, because when I was in school, and she told my commanding officer that I used to beat her, I didn't send money, and children were starving, my son was starving. So when I reported to the unit, I actually had discharge paperwork on the desk. Hadn't met her before, it was my very first time, and I told her it was all lies, you know, and after a few phone calls, I had to send money orders home, send $750 a month home, and after a few attempts, my ex-wife called her and said, he's not sending money. My commander said, you know what, I physically walk him down to the mailbox and watch him mail you payments. And that was before the allotment started. And my ex-wife called her the C word, the F and C word, all this other stuff. And at that time, my commander was like, oh. So it was at that time I decided, you know what, I'm going to show you. I became the best soldier possible. And I actually went out to become Soldier of the Year. And I became Soldier of the Year for the first time, won the board. And actually after that, the only reason I did it the first time is because they made me do it, or I wanted to do it to prove myself. And then the next 2 years after that, they made me go up for it because they wanted me to compete for the base level. Second year, I won the base level, Soldier of the Year. And then the third year, they made me do it again because they wanted me to compete for the United States Army Finance Corps. And unfortunately, I did lose that because I didn't have any college at the time, because Marine Corps infantry was a little bit hard to get college. But that was part 2 of my speech. There's a lot more to it, and I'll have to touch base with you on part 3. But the biggest thing for me is to tell you that keep your head down and keep moving forward, and things eventually do work out. I had some very difficult times, both during the First War with what I saw there, and what happened with my son when I came back and going to court for him. It was very difficult, but I decided I want to keep my head down and keep moving forward, and things will get better, and eventually they did. But we'll get to that the next time, and I really do appreciate your time. Thank you very much. That was really terrible today.
No.